Have a national religion, they don't have a national language, they don't have something that you can point to from centuries and centuries back. There's no Americanness the way you might say there is a Russianness or a Grecianness or an Italianness or something like that. Americans are organized around.
What is the ethnicity of an American? If you said American, then you're wrong. Because being American is basically just a prefix, as the entire country, throughout its history, has been made up of a population that shares different cultural backgrounds and beliefs. They may identify as American today, but the truth is, technically, their actual ethnicities lie outside the shores of the United States. In this video, we shall explore the reason why Americans do not exist as an ethnicity, and if that status could ever change. Stay tuned. The word ethnicity basically refers to the shared cultural, traditional, or familial bonds that connect a group of people. This can include common ancestry, language, history, society, religion, and social beliefs. Unlike race, which is often based on DNA-supported physical attributes, ethnicity is more about cultural identity and heritage, so it's not a matter of white or black or even brown. Speaking of colors, a thumbs up on the video or a subscription to the channel would be a non-discriminatory green flag, which is a prerequisite to belonging to our own special ethnic group. Today, the group most commonly referred to as white Americans, which makes up the majority of the population, mostly comprise of Europeans who immigrated from Europe and other continents and their descendants. Most of them are actually English, German, Italian, or of French heritage.
Nowadays, light-skinned people of European descent are typically considered white in the United States. It doesn't matter whether your heritage is British or Irish or Italian or Polish or German, you're just white.
Even though looks aren't important in determining ethnicity, the easiest way to tell how different Americans are ethnically is actually from the diversity in terms of appearances. America is one of the most diverse nations on Earth. Even by looks, and ethnic groups commonly share a spectrum of genetic ancestry, even though some groups have considerably mixed genetic ancestry. Ethnicity is sometimes complex to determine because factors such as intermarriage, acculturation, adoption, and religious conversion have been known to alter the ethnicities of individuals over the span of generations. This is why ethnic groups are often divided into subgroups or tribes, which over time may become separate ethnic groups themselves due to factors such as physical isolation from the parent group. Incidences like this are common across the globe, but particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and some parts of Asia. Within America, there are different groups, fully regarded as Americans, which share certain ethnic identities that band them together. For instance, there are the ethno-nationals, such as the Italian Americans and Nigerian Americans, and ethno-racial groups, such as the African and Asian Americans. The former is more defined, as those individuals can trace their heritage back to their original countries, and sometimes even ethnicities. The latter, on the other hand, is often vaguer, as it is mostly determined based on physical appearance. Fun fact: the largest ethnic group in the United States is actually the German Americans, which are made up of a reported 42.4 million people, or 17% of the current population. They are majorly the reason why foods like hamburgers and sauerkrauts are popular in the US today. Despite these classifications, the concept of ethnicity isn't straightforward as you might think. In fact, in some conditions, the concept is so ambiguous that experts have begun to suggest that it's discarded as a means of identifying individuals who live outside their genetic homelands. Let's find out why. Defining the ethnicity of an individual is really difficult, but more so from an American standpoint. Because while you may define a Chinese American as ethnically Chinese, that individual is classified differently back in China. China has 56 officially recognized ethnicities, such as the Han and the Mongols, and some countries like India and Nigeria have even more. Ethnicity is sometimes identified with political states that may not have existed in their current form when populations migrated out of them. For example, Italian is widely considered an ethnicity in the US today, but some days earlier, Italian migrants might not have been describing themselves as Italian due to the regional differences within the population when they began to mass migrate to the US. Fun fact: A majority of the Jewish American citizens didn't migrate into America from present-day Israel, but rather from other parts of Central and Eastern Europe throughout the 19th century. In fact, some Jewish Americans have never been to Israel as it exists today. The same could be said of African American populations, who were brought to the shores of America during the era of the slave trade. These individuals have dozens of ethnicities of their own, which have now been erased after centuries of assimilation. Today, most of them refer to themselves as just African American, which, while defined as an ethnicity in the US, isn't exactly the same in Africa.
In the United States, we don't care about your nationality, where you're actually born and raised and from. We're looking at ethnic background. So if your ethnic background is Mexican, whether you were born there or not, you're perceived as Mexican.
Additionally, the definition of ethnical relations is often fluid even within groups widely regarded as belonging to the same ethnicity. For instance, a person with Puerto Rican parents who doesn't speak Spanish might be seen by others in the Latino community as not Latino enough, just as a person with one Korean parent might not be seen as not Asian enough. The most interesting thing about the lack of an American ethnicity is that even its original inhabitants, the Native Americans, didn't actually have defined ethnicities. In fact, natives of both continents of the Americas, North and South, share the same condition. That is because indigenous Native American groups often classify themselves into tribes, as the notion of a country with several ethnicities didn't exist to them before the Europeans arrived. A similar phenomenon could be seen in sub-Saharan African populations, which existed within ethnic borders that moved around and assimilated a lot before the arrival of the Europeans, where they were forced to take up a more tribal identity due to the new lines drawn up by colonizers. Despite the ambiguity of ethnicity, it is still commonly defined in every nation on the planet, and the United States is no different. In fact, the US government is making big moves to improve the ethnical classification of Americans. This can be seen in its most recent conducted census exercise, which has thrown up some intriguing points about ethnicity in the country. Let's see what they are. The most recent census program held in the US happened back in April 2020, and it was in many ways different to the usual kind of census exercise done by the US in recent history.
Tonight, the U.S. Census Bureau is changing how it categorizes people by race and ethnicity. The form will now have one question regarding race and ethnicity. Response options will now include 7 broad categories, including white, Hispanic or Latino, and Black or African American.
The 2020 census was the first to allow citizens to identify themselves as coming from Middle Eastern or North African countries, otherwise known as MENA, in the first major alteration to the exercise since 1997. Under the former standard, individuals of MENA descent were typically considered racially white.
Decades in the making, the next U.S. Census will finally count Arab Americans with the creation of a new category. Previously, Arab Americans were often forced to choose between white or other.
The U.S. Office of Management and Budget, which determines the racial categories used by the Census Bureau, currently outlines 6 racial groups. They are American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, white, and some other race, which is where most Hispanics fall under. All of these classifications aren't exactly close to what you would regard to the average MENA descendant to look like. While there wasn't actually a separate MENA category in the 2020 census, responders were encouraged to write in their backgrounds, and if they wrote Syrian or Moroccan, for instance, they would be classified as MENA. The 2020 census marked a first time since 1960 that the census asked people who marked the box for white and or black in race to also fill out a write-in area with their non-Hispanic origins, such as German, Haitian, Irish, or Jamaican. Fun fact: the U.S. 2020 census cost the U.S. taxpayer over $6.3 billion to conduct, which is one of the highest figures ever budgeted for a similar program anywhere in the world. The results of the alteration to the census process was that it allowed some of the population to better understand their representation as a group. Of the genetically Native Americans, 1.5 million identified themselves as belonging to the Cherokee tribe, while the figure was 580,000 for Aztecs and 300,000 for Mayans. However, 1.7 million individuals of Native American ancestry did not specify what tribes they belonged to. For Asian Americans, over 5.2 million identified as Chinese, Nearly 4.8 million identified as Asian Indian and almost 4.5 million identified as Filipino. In terms of the Black American population, over 17 million identified simply as Black or African American, but individuals from other groups such as Jamaicans and Haitian identified with their country of origin. Nigerian Americans, with over 600,000 people, came out as the African population group most represented in the United States, even when accounting for the MENA groups which exist in Africa, such as Egypt, which has a population of just over 400,000. While the results of this change in format to the 2020 census were positive in some ways, they also exposed an overarching problem of defining ethnicities in a country like the US. Let's find out what made the exercise so crucial. Not every US group is happy with the US classification of race and ethnicity in the census. For instance, Black Arabs from countries such as Somalia and Sudan and Armenia were omitted from the MENA classifications.
Rightfully concerned about communities like mine that are at serious risk of being undercounted in 2020 census. But something I'm particularly concerned about is the lack of representation on the form of people who look like me.
Armenia itself was omitted from the MENA subcategories, which means many ethnical Armenians likely categorize themselves as being from a different country despite having an American population of almost 500,000. The Hmong people, who number north of 380,000 in the US, feel they have also been wrongly classified as East Asian due to the fact that China is thought to be their ancestral home, even though they had been oppressed as a minority and had to flee to mainland China to Southeastern Asian countries. This is also despite an overwhelming majority of the original US population migrating to the US from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia after helping the US fight against communists during the Vietnam War. This method of classifying various groups could hide socioeconomic disparities between ethnicities regarded as belonging to the same group. It also could diminish the number of official ethnicities and reduce their power when it comes to redrawing political districts, even in places where they have large communities.
Play a role in how people are perceived and therefore the opportunities that are available to them. A person's race influences a whole host of social outcomes, from their education to their income.
However, arguably the best way for most of these classifications to go away for good is if every US citizen today decides to belong to a single ethnic group, an American ethnic group which overrides their current ethnic identities. But is that even possible? Theoretically, there are ways Americans could converge on a single ethnicity. One of these ways is through ethnogenesis, which is the formation of a separate ethnic identity either through division or amalgamation. In the same way that ethnicities could be divided into subgroups or tribes, formerly separate ethnicities can also merge to form a pan-ethnicity, and could eventually also merge into one single ethnicity. But could Americans really experience ethnogenesis? The answer to that question is difficult, because ethnicities and even tribes are known to form much more easily when they live in relative isolation from the rest of the world. However, if you know anything about America, it's that despite basically being a subcontinent of its own, it isn't a country that has exactly embraced isolation. Globalization, aka the reason you probably have a phone or computer to watch this video, is one of the agendas most pushed by the United States. The US wouldn't be the largest economy in the history of this planet if it didn't support global trade the way it did following the end of World War II. The country is already hugely invested in globalization supporting infrastructure, so unless internal policies reverse this, it is unlikely that it's ever going to be isolated from the rest of the world. The Biden administration is reportedly proposing changes to the 2030 census that would affect how certain populations in the US are counted. For example, in the 2020 census, some other race was the second largest racial group, with 49.9 million people opting for it. This means a vast amount of crucial information is still left vague to observers. The proposed changes would also require the collection of more detailed information on national or tribal origin within each of the major racial or ethnic categories. An example provided by the working group includes checkboxes for some common subgroups, as well as an open-ended box in which respondents could write any additional detail they wanted to share. These steps would help in addressing some of the problems faced in defining ethnicity within the US. But it barely does anything in terms of helping the nation form a unique ethnic identity of its own. So how can this be done? Whether or not a group of people can create a unique ethnic heritage over a period of time depends on some very important factors. First up is the heritage of the different ethnic groups. The origination of a people and their culture can determine if they're willing to assimilate into a new way of life that alienates most of their heritage or not. Some ethnicities do not care to mix with others, while this barrier is almost non-existent in others. This point can further be aggravated and historical animosities persist among some of the ethnic groups represented within the country. Another important factor is religious and cultural rights. Some ethnicities absolutely hate the kind of food or religious practices or even lifestyles which others are more accepting of. This means most mixtures between both ethnicities would not be seen in a positive light, at least traditionally speaking. Additionally, in a country as diverse as the United States, not every ethnic group is keen on race mixing, as some may see the physical features as important to their identification. As a result of these factors, it would be difficult for the US to become ethnically homogenous, and even if it does happen, it may take some centuries. Who knows? Maybe one of your descendants might watch this video in 300 years and laugh. Ultimately, given that classifications such as ethnicity are social constructions, there is a real temptation to suggest that they can be discarded, at least in diverse societies such as the US. On an individual level, no one wants to feel constrained by stereotypes or perceptions that others have of them just because of their racial or ethnic identity. However, at the same time, classification of citizens based on ethnicity is of considerable importance to any society, and understanding it as necessary to determine where disparities are prevalent and how they might be addressed. What do you think? Can America ever evolve into an ethnicity? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more captivating episodes. And remember, a person who does not know his past has no future.